Hi everybody, my name is Danny Taylor, owner of VeganProteins.com and the co-founder of Team Plant Built. And I coach vegan athletes, and a few weeks ago I asked what people struggled with the most in terms of their fitness or nutrition, and the overwhelming winner was emotional eating or binge eating. So I decided to make a series about that, and I did the first video last week, and I've also been doing some posts on Instagram about this as well. But today is the second video. So first of all, excuse me, I have a bit of a cold, so I'm a little bit sniffly in my throat. It's kind of scratchy, so sorry. So last week's video, we talked about red flags that you may notice if you are struggling with emotional eating or binge eating or just overeating and not really understanding why it's happening. What some of the red flags were, if maybe you had a problem or some problem areas that you wanted to focus on, and also some avenues that you could take to get more professional help for this other than just YouTube videos and Instagram posts. But this week we are going to, I promised you guys some actionable steps that you could take to help begin to rectify these things, or at least reduce the occurrence of them. And I think it's really important with these things to kind of go for the low-hanging fruit first. The very deeply emotional kind of addiction to these types of behaviors is probably the hardest stuff to conquer. Not to say it can't be done, it absolutely can. However, there are some other things that are much easier to deal with. And if you start to deal with those things first, kind of knock those easy ones out of the park, then it becomes a little bit easier to focus on the more challenging stuff. So today we're going to focus on the things that are a little bit easier to fix. And mainly that is some of the physiological reasons why we may binge eat or overeat without knowing why. So in my opinion and my experience coaching hundreds of individuals, the number one reason why people end up binge eating or overeating at the end of the day, or having a stressful situation and just eating way more than they intended to, is because they're not eating enough in the first place. They are kind of living their life calorie restricted. And when you do that, every physiological part of your body is basically crying out for food and trying to get you to eat more in any way that it can. And oftentimes like pretty dense foods, because your body's like main gig is self-preservation, right? It wants to keep you alive however it need be. And if you're constantly underfeeding your body, it thinks that you're starving, basically, and it starts sending you all sorts of signals, consciously and subconsciously, that you need to get more food in you, and it will strike whenever it can. So the number one thing is people under eating. Now, what does this mean? It can mean a few things. It can mean maybe you started out on a diet and you decided, I'm gonna lose 15 pounds. So you go on this really, really intense diet to lose 15 pounds as quickly as possible. Well, when you do that, you are oftentimes setting yourself up for failure by setting that deficit, the caloric deficit, too steep right from the get-go, and it's not maintainable. So maybe you can maintain it for a couple days, or maybe you're in a situation where you eat perfectly from the time you wake up until the time you get home from work. Your eating is on point with what you're hoping for, but then the end of the day comes and you are just like a snack monster and you can't stop until you like wipe out the cupboards. It's not that you're a failure or that you have no willpower, it's that you didn't eat enough during the day, and your body knows it, and you're tired, you're undernourished, and you will mindlessly just start grabbing at foods. So that's a major one. Whether the goal is to actually, maybe you're not even trying to go on a diet, maybe you're just so busy that you're under eating all day and then overeating by a lot at night. Some planning in advance can definitely help to stop this from happening. Making sure that you have a nice hearty breakfast and a hearty lunch and some healthy snacks on hand can be super, super helpful to make it so that you're not overeating at the end of the night. The other thing is, if you are intending to be in a fat loss phase of some kind, making sure that that deficit is as small as it needs to be to make progress. Dieting is a skill, and it's something that you have to learn and kind of build up your tolerance to over time. You wouldn't go from sitting on the couch 12 hours a day to just being like, I'm gonna run a marathon, and going outside and trying to run a marathon. You know that would not work. You would get hurt, you wouldn't be able to do it. You know, you just wouldn't do it. So why do we take that approach to dieting all the time? We eat too much, or eat poorly, or eat without paying any attention to what we're eating at all, and then all of a sudden going, I'm gonna go on this crazy diet where I just drink liquids for a week, or I'm gonna cut out all carbs. And for some reason we think that's going to be successful, and it is so not going to be successful. It might be successful for a day, 2 days, maybe even a couple of weeks, but eventually this diet is going to come crashing down around you, and generally it's going to result in a massive amount of overeating. And that's not what I would consider to be emotional eating. That's a physiological response to a diet that is silly, basically. So same way you would start on a goal of running a marathon, maybe you'd walk a lap around your block and then run a lap around your block. You want to start with the smallest deficit that you can tolerate and maintain, and that it doesn't negatively affect your life in a big way. So, you know, chopping 1,500 calories right off your day from day one, if you don't have a history of successfully dieting and successfully creating those habits and keeping them maintainable, you're setting yourself up to fail, and you're going to be very down on yourself when it happens. So set your deficit as small as possible. Better to make small baby steps towards your fat loss goal than to take a couple of giant steps forward and then backslide to before where you even started. Another way that we can create this deficit is not just by under eating. That's one way to create a deficit, but another one can be over exercising. So even though I said, you know, you wouldn't just wake up and try to run a marathon, some people in essence do kind of do that. They go from not exercising at all to suddenly exercising for, you know, a couple hours a day, and that creates a huge caloric deficit as well. So if you have added that much exercise but you haven't replenished some of those calories, you're going to be really, really hungry, and you are not going to have a lot of willpower around food simply because you are in such an energy deficit. So the same way we want to start with a small deficit in a diet, we also want to start with a small amount of extra calories burned via exercise until you can tolerate it, make sure that it's maintainable, check your progress. Maybe you don't even need to increase it. Maybe you can just maintain that for quite a while and still make good progress. But there's really no point in starting with a huge deficit with calories or a huge deficit with cardio right out of the gate, because you're going to be very hungry. It's not going to be maintainable, and you're probably going to end up overeating, especially if you already tend towards overeating in the first place. You're much more likely to sort of slip through the cracks of accidentally overeating or binge eating when you create an energy deficit that is far too large. Along with the same energy deficit, which again, time and time again, this is the reason people are struggling with what they are perceiving as emotional eating or what is binge eating, is just because they're not eating enough regularly. And another thing, even if people aren't necessarily tracking calories, if they decide to cut out entire food groups, essentially they're creating the same calorie deficit just by cutting out the food groups, which creates this link in their mind that X food is bad, but really it's just the calories that you remove when you take that food away creates the deficit. Calorie deficits are how to lose weight, regardless of whether those calories are from carbs, fat, or even protein. A calorie deficit is a calorie deficit regardless of what those foods come from. But a lot of people will approach a diet or even just approach food with a mindset of, for example, carbs are bad. So they cut out carbs And then they lose this weight and they think, see, carbs are bad. I stopped eating carbs and I lost all this weight, so carbs are bad. When really they cut out carbs and ergo they cut out, 30% of their daily calories, creating this huge calorie deficit. And then eventually, because of this calorie deficit, they're very hungry, they end up overeating, and then they think, well, I'm just addicted to carbs. And that's how I got here, is because I'm addicted to carbs, or I'm addicted to sugar and I can't go without them. But really, had they maybe just cut back a little bit on calories here and there, they're probably able to continue to have those foods without overindulging on them. So there's not an addiction to the food per se, although there might be, but that could be a separate issue. A lot of times people think they're addicted to food, a certain food, but really they were just under eating, and cutting out whole food groups isn't maintainable long term. So when they inevitably have to introduce this type of food back into their life, they've missed it, they're hungry, and they end up overeating it. So it's actually better to keep these foods, for many people, it's better to keep small amounts of these foods in your diet in a way that you're paying attention to portion sizes and really just learning about nutrition and how it works in the body. You don't have to have a degree in nutrition to try and learn things here and there and make it so that you understand how certain types of foods work in the body and why they have value to your personal diet. So in essence, cutting out entire food groups is essentially just a different way of cutting calories. So when you cut out entire food groups, again, we're back to that steep calorie deficit, and you end up overeating simply because your body is hungry. And then on a much smaller scale, we talked about people that are just busy. And a lot of this really does just come down to planning. Even if you're not necessarily on a diet per se, if you wake up and rush out the door, skip breakfast, get to work, work through your lunch, maybe eat a snack while you're working, get home, it's no wonder that you're eating everything in the fridge when you get home. You just went the whole day without eating, and your body really, really wants some nutrients. And once you start, you're so hungry, it can be very hard to stop. So this isn't necessarily an instance of you set your calorie deficit too steep. It's just that you went too long without eating. And the hungrier you are, generally, the more you're gonna eat, because the faster you're gonna eat. And the faster you eat, the more calories you get down before your stomach says to your brain, hey, we're full. So you've ended up eating maybe more than you need to in a shorter amount of time, when if you just hadn't allowed yourself to get that hungry in the first place, you probably wouldn't have. So these are many ways that I just explained of creating a calorie deficit, and all of them can be avoided with better planning. So a lot of times when we're in this cycle of emotional eating or binge eating, we're just so caught up in the cycle that we kind of can't stop. And we eat several times a day generally, so it can be hard to be like, okay, stop the press, I need to make a plan and stick to it, because you're kind of in the middle of it all the time. But it's very important to start to create a plan for yourself. If you have no idea how much you're eating, it might be a good idea to just jot down what you're eating and total it up for a few days, just to get an idea of if you're in the ballpark of what is healthy. A lot of people will find they eat super, super well Monday through Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday just go off the rails. And a lot of times this super, super well Monday through Friday, when you look at it, it's severely under eating. So by the time the weekend comes, they're hungry, they have less inhibitions because they have less in their schedule, and they just end up making up that deficit, and oftentimes then some on the weekends. But if you take a little time on the weekend, generally for people, but really any day that you can commit to is fine, and just sort of plan out, you don't have to plan out with numbers and calories and macros or anything, but just plan out what you're gonna eat for the week and make sure that you have those foods available. Simple things like keeping protein bars or whole fruit or packages of nuts like in your purse or in your car or at your desk at work can really, really help to make it so you don't allow yourself to get too hungry. And if you always have healthy foods available, you're more likely to reach for those than you are to get to a place where you're hungry and then you have to decide what to eat. And then maybe you pick something that you wouldn't have picked had you not allowed yourself to get that hungry. And this goes not just meal to meal, but also day to day. A deficit is a deficit, and your body does not know what 24 hours is. It doesn't know what 2 days is. It doesn't know what a week is. If you undereat for 8 hours, you're hungrier after that. If you undereat for 3 days, you're hungrier after that. So making sure that you're kind of keeping your intake relatively stable from day to day, and I think throughout the day, particularly for people who tend towards emotional eating. You know, there's the whole intermittent fasting thing, which I'm not really for or against. I just think that it really depends on the individual. But in general, I find that people that err on the side of binge eating, overeating, emotional eating, just tend to do better with their food spread out over the day a little bit more. That's a generalization. Everybody is different, but it is something that I've noticed. So planning in advance to make sure that you're eating enough food and spread out evenly and making it really, really easy and convenient for you to have is really gonna help nip that physiological hunger in the bud so that you don't find yourself just turning to the closest food and eating as quickly as possible. So there are more physiological things that we have coming up, but I've already talked for about 18 minutes now. This is gonna be fun to edit down. So I'm gonna stop this video here and we will talk about some other physiological things that you can do to help keep binge eating at bay. And I think that's it. I will talk to you soon. Bye.